Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please visit our website, weather.gov/Alaska, get updates to the forecast, or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. Also call our weather info line, 1-800-472-0391, get updates to the forecast through that means as well. Starting off, we'll look at some of the records that we broke over the weekend here. Up in Fairbanks, we set a high temperature record of 48 degrees on October 30th. The previous one was 45 degrees. That was way back in 1928 and again in 1934, so beat that one by 3 degrees on October 30th. We also set some precipitation records down around the Kenai Peninsula area. So in Alyeska at low-lying areas, not up on the mountain, we did set a new record of 9.53 inches. That's a full day, 24-hour record. And this was on the 31st. This beat the old one by over 2.5 inches. Quite a big jump there for that. And then down by Portage, we did have another value broken at 10.34 inches of rainfall. Again, that's a 24-hour period. This was on the 30th and beat the old record by over an inch. And there was even more rainfall. This is not storm total. This is only the 24-hour. It had gotten over 16 inches total for that Portage Glacier area, and even more probably since the time that we took that last measurement. So for the rest of the hazards throughout the state, we do have a winter weather advisory for snow for the eastern portion of the Alaska Range. Again, that's going to be for snow up to 4 inches with localized amounts up to as high as 11 inches. One of the areas most heavily going to be impacted by the snow will be Isabel Pass. And then we also have a winter storm warning out. This is for heavy snow and blowing snow for the southern side of the Seward Peninsula, and this does include Nome. This is going to be in effect until 4 p.m. on Tuesday, with snow amounts of 3 to 5 inches, and localized amounts could be up to as high as 9 inches. Taking a look at the satellite imagery of some of the cause of this heavier snow. Look out over the Gulf waters where we have low pressure moving into the Gulf with some of that band of moisture and cloud cover that you see moving in over the eastern and central portions of mainland Alaska, helping to bring in some of that heavier snowfall to the Alaska Range. As you look at this loop again, we'll focus now on the Bering Sea. We have multiple lows moving in. We have one near the western Aleutian Islands starting to bring down some colder air to that area. And then another low near the St. Matthew Island area. You can see the cloud cover approaching or moving into the Seward Peninsula area. It's helping to bring the heavier snow to that area as well. And then finally, we'll look over the western portion of the state where we do have some high pressure moving in, starting to clear out some of the higher clouds. But if you notice underneath some of the darker, the grayer cloud cover does indicate some low level clouds that still could produce some snow to some of the areas over the western portion of the mainland. Now we'll look at the weather for the remainder of today. We'll start off in the Bering Sea with our multiple lows moving through the area. Primarily going to be rain for the Aleutian Islands and much of the southern portion of the Bering Sea as well, but we do have some of the colder air coming in around this system, starting to transition the western Aleutian Islands over to a rain and snow mix. And then out ahead of this system along the southwest coastline, we are seeing rain as we get near to the Bering Sea waters, but we are expecting snow as we travel farther inland and farther to the north, especially as we get into the Norton Sound and Seward Peninsula areas. Over the central and western portion of the state, we're also going to see some snow that extends through the Brooks Range and up to the Arctic coastline as well. And then down in south central Alaska, low pressure out over the Gulf is bringing a lot more rain to the North Gulf Coast area and low-lying areas around much of south central Alaska. Higher elevations are going to start to mix with snow, as well as more interior locations such as the Copper River Basin. Down in the Panhandle, high pressure is dominating, keeping the rain at bay for now, but as we move into tonight, southern and central portions of the Panhandle will start to see some rain moving in from that southerly flow from the low that is just to the south of the Gulf of Alaska. We're also going to see continued rain along the North Gulf Coast, with low-lying areas staying rain as we move into south central Alaska, but snow at higher elevations. That snow is going to continue through the Alaska Range, central and eastern portions of the interior, and up through the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline, those eastern portions. Down the west coast of the state, we're going to see snow extending farther inland and farther to the north from our low that is now going to be by St. Lawrence Island. Still down by the southwest coastline, we will see some mix of rain and snow with some of the warmer air coming in off of the water to the south. Our low pressure that was out over the western Bering, however, will have moved to the central Aleutians, pulling down more cold air from the north, transitioning the western Aleutian Islands over to snow and the central Aleutians over to a rain and snow mix. Going to see primarily rain for the eastern Aleutians as well as much of the Alaska Peninsula. As we move into Wednesday, that low starts to weaken and push out by the eastern Aleutians, allowing for rain to return to the central Aleutian Islands as well as much of the southern Bering Sea. But our other low settling in just to the south of St. Lawrence Island, still some colder air coming in behind that, bringing into the northern portions of the Bering Sea more snow. Snow is going to continue for much of mainland Alaska, albeit lighter for much of the central and eastern portions of the state. And then down along the west coast should be a little bit heavier still, as we do have some of that southerly flow coming up off of the Gulf waters. That is going to be a little bit of a transition to rain and snow for the southwest coastline once again, and along the North Gulf Coast to include much of south central Alaska. Down in the Panhandle, primarily rain will be expected, but some of the more interior locations as well as the coastal ranges should see a little bit of snow mixing in. For Wednesday, similar pattern for southeastern portions of the state. We'll see primarily rain, but a little bit more snow as we get into the coastal ranges and areas farther to the north, such as Lynn Canal. For the south central locations, going to see southerly flow continuing, bringing more rain to the North Gulf Coast. Not as much will make it through the mountain ranges as we had seen in the earlier days, but we will still see some of the higher elevations transition to snow and some snow still in the Alaska Range. All along the western portions of the state, from Bristol Bay up the west coast to the western interior, all of the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline do expect to see more snow on Wednesday. That over the Bering Sea, cold or northerly flow is going to bring snow showers throughout the Bering and Aleutian Islands. Taking a look now at our temperatures for Tuesday morning, lows for the Panhandle area dropping down into the lower 40s for southern locations and down to near 30 for northern locations. In south central Alaska into the 30s, with more interior locations dropping down even farther, such as 25 degrees for Golcana. Tuesday afternoon highs in the Panhandle area getting up to right around 50 degrees for southern locations and anywhere near the Gulf waters. However, more interior locations farther to the north are going to drop down or only get up into the 40s, 43 for Juneau, 44 for Haines. For south central Alaska, getting up into the 40s for most locations around Kenai Peninsula and near the Gulf, and then in the 30s for farther north locations. Wednesday morning in the Panhandle going to drop down into the lower 40s for southern locations and mid-30s for northern locations. For the south central area, we're going to drop down into the 30s near the water with 35 for Kodiak, 32 for Homer, 38 for Seward. But the places around Cook Inlet will be a little bit colder, closer to 30 degrees. Kenai going to get down to 28 degrees. And then in the 20s for the Susitna Valley as well as the Copper River Basin. Wednesday afternoon highs in the Panhandle going to get up into the upper 40s to lower 50s for southern locations and mid 40s farther to the north, with Yakutat getting up to 47 degrees. South central Alaska near the Gulf waters, we're going to get into the mid 40s, 46 for Seward, 44 for Valdez, right around 40 degrees for places around Cook Inlet, and the more landlocked locations going to only get up into the 30s, 33 for Golcana. Looking into the interior portions of the state, low temperatures on Tuesday morning going to drop down into the 20s for eastern locations. Fairbanks at 26 degrees. Single digits as we move farther to the west, with Galena getting down to 9 degrees. And then along the west coast, a little bit warmer with some of that southerly flow, only getting down into the 20s, 26 for Nome and 27 for Savunga. Up along the Arctic coastline, single digits for western locations, Utqiagvik all the way down to 1 degree, and then in the teens out east. Tuesday afternoon highs in the 30s for much of the eastern interior, teens as we get to the western interior, and then back to the 30s along the west coast. Up along the Arctic coastline, going to get up into the teens out west and 20s out east. Wednesday morning dropping down into the 20s for much of the interior, teens out west, 20s again along the coastline, and single digits for the western North Slope and in the teens for the east. Wednesday afternoon highs getting up into the 30s for the eastern interior, 20s for much of the rest of the interior, as well as along the coast. Savunga a little bit warmer, 32 degrees, and then 20s along the Arctic coastline. Southwest Alaska, teens in the interior, 30s along the coast, and then 30s throughout the Aleutian Islands as well. Tuesday afternoon highs, 20s interior for southwest, in the 30s as we get by the water, and then in the 40s for the Aleutians. Wednesday morning lows in the interior portions of southwest Alaska dropping down into the teens, 20s along the water, and then in the 30s for the Aleutian Islands, 29 for St. Paul. Into the 20s for highs on Wednesday afternoon for interior locations of southwest, 30s near the coast, and 30s to 40s for the Aleutian Islands. Take a quick look at our climate outlook. This is the 6 to 10 day CPC forecast for November 6th to 10th. We are looking at higher probabilities to be below normal temperatures for southwest Alaska, as well as western and south central, and then for the Panhandle. In our 8 to 10 day forecast, November 8th to 14th, however, we are going to see this transition a little bit more, bringing in more of the interior into the probabilities to be below normal, all of southern mainland with a high spot around Bristol Bay area and down in the Panhandle.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Tuesday morning. A mixture of VFR and NVFR conditions out for the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. As we move into mainland Alaska, you're going to see quite a few areas of IFR for the southern half of the mainland, extending down to the Kenai Peninsula, as well as up into the interior and the west coast. For the Brooks Range, more VFR and NVFR conditions, but then along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see quite a bit of IFR, especially for the eastern locations. Finally, down in the Panhandle, northern locations should be VFR, but we will see some marginal conditions in central and southern locations. Tuesday afternoon, clearing up quite a bit for the Panhandle and the central and southern locations, expecting to see a lot more VFR with some isolated areas of NVFR, but as we move up to the northern portions of Lynn Canal, we do expect that to drop down to IFR conditions. Out of our south central Alaska eastern areas, you're going to see some IFR conditions. Through much of the interior, we'll see some VFR with some areas of NVFR. Brooks Range is going to start to see more IFR, and then spotty areas of IFR along the Arctic coast. Down the west coast of the state, we've got increasingly worse conditions until we get down to the southwest, where we will see some IFR conditions. Then out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, a mixture of VFR and NVFR. For Wednesday morning, primarily NVFR out over the Bering Sea. Southwest Alaska will see primarily IFR conditions that will extend into much of the central and western portions of the interior. The North Slope will also see quite a bit of IFR conditions. And then down in south central Alaska, primarily NVFR with some isolated areas of IFR expected. Down in the Panhandle, also going to be primarily NVFR with some IFR areas farther to the north. Wednesday afternoon, going to continue to see primarily NVFR conditions for the Panhandle area, but we will see some IFR conditions in the coastal ranges as well as in northern locations. Primarily NVFR for south central Alaska as well as much of the western interior, some spotty areas of VFR for the central and eastern interior. Then up along the Arctic coastline, primarily NVFR and IFR conditions, and then down the west coast, primarily NVFR with some isolated areas of IFR. Then for the Bering Sea and Aleutians, NVFR conditions are expected. Through the passes on Tuesday, AKwx should be NVFR throughout the day, as well as at Adigan. Lake Clark should be VFR throughout the day Tuesday, however, Merrill will start off NVFR and then improve to VFR in the afternoon. Granny Pass should be NVFR all day Tuesday, and Windy should be IFR and improve to marginal conditions later in the day. Isabel Pass will also start off IFR and improve to NVFR. Mentasta will start off NVFR and then improve all the way to VFR. Tenita should be IFR throughout the day on Tuesday as well as at Portage. And then Chilkoot and White should both start VFR and then drop all the way down to IFR in the afternoon. Taking a look at our freezing levels, our surface freezing line moves through the Bering Sea up to the Seward Peninsula, down through southwest Alaska, and then through south central. We have an area of warmer air out by the southeastern portions of the state with freezing levels up to as high as 6,000 feet over the Panhandle area. For our icing, quite a bit of icing with all the precip that we are seeing. We will have above 4,000 feet for the Panhandle as well as south central Alaska, below 10,000 feet for much of the interior and Brooks Range. Then along the west coast, below 10,000 feet, becoming between 2,000 and 6,000 feet as we move down into the eastern Bering and Alaska Peninsula area, and then between 1,000 and 5,000 feet by the western Aleutians. For our jet stream, strongest portion of the jet over the state is going to be at 100 knots out of a southwesterly direction over the North Slope area. We're going to see that southerly flow throughout mainland Alaska. Then over the Aleutians, we'll see more of a northerly component. Winds quite a bit weaker, around 50 knots. 4 to 9,000 feet, we'll see some stronger winds for the Aleutian Islands, still out of a northerly direction, up to as high as 55 knots by the central Aleutians. Up the west coast of the state, stronger band of winds there out of a southerly direction, up to as high as 45 knots. Then out by south central Alaska, winds up to 50 to 55 knots out of a south to southeast direction. And then over the Panhandle, expecting 45 to 50 knots out of the south. Down to 3,000 feet, southeasterly winds through the inside waters of the Panhandle, up to as high as 50 knots, stronger as we get to the Gulf and areas farther to the south. Up in the northern portions of the Gulf, winds out of a southeasterly direction, up to as high as 55 knots. Then out over mainland Alaska and the Yukon Flats area, easterly winds 30 knots, picking up to 50 knots along the Arctic coastline for those eastern locations, right around Dead Horse, southeasterly winds there. Along the west coast of the state, continuing with that southerly flow up to as high as 45 knots over the YK Delta area. Then out over the Bering Sea, we're seeing northerly winds on the other side of that eastern Bering low, up to as high as 50 knots for the Pribilof Islands and eastern Aleutians, and then 45 knots by the western Aleutians. Quite a bit of turbulence throughout the Aleutian Islands, North Gulf Coast, Kodiak Island, West Coast, with all those stronger winds that we are seeing, primarily all going to be below 5,000 feet, and then we'll see some other areas of turbulence below 5,000 feet near the Alaska Range and northern portions of the interior.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
The Space Weather Prediction Center has had a long-standing relationship with the power industry, so they've been aware that solar storms, the geomagnetic storm piece of that, can affect the operation of their systems and induce extra currents and loads on those systems that can either trip those systems offline or in the worst of cases, cause damage. That relationship goes back for several decades. In fact, a big incident in 1989 where part of Quebec was tripped offline that affected something like 6 million customers for about 9 hours. I think that really raised the awareness in the power industries.
When we get the alert, we watch the grid and start looking for issues. Are we seeing a decline in voltage? Are we seeing equipment failures? And we readjust the system to try to mitigate those problems, try to keep the lights on and keep it from going out.
Averaging about 500, 550 kilometers per second.
If we didn't have this early warning, we wouldn't see it until our sensor saw it. Getting more information quicker and faster before the storm hits, not during the storm, is a big improvement.
In the long term, I think what we need and what we're moving toward, the U.S. as a whole, is better modeling, fully understanding this phenomenon, understanding how it would impact specific systems.
Rather than actually experiencing a storm, we can simulate storms in our software and see what the impact is. We try to get ahead of it. We always plan that if there's an outage, how can we keep the lights on? What's the best process to prevent it?
In the end, 5 to 10 years from now, there's going to be a whole mix of operational procedures driven by what we do on prediction and warning. And then there also will probably be some level of hardware controls to ensure the reliability of the grid.
Space weather affects technologies. As conditions develop, we put out alerts, warnings, and watches to our customers so they can take action.
There's different types of impacts on communication systems, and the HF we call the high frequency, which is that band of communications 3 to 30 megahertz. But it's a very important band of radio communication because it's used widespread. It's used, for example, by the airlines.
HF radio is most commonly used for position reporting when you're going across the ocean airspace, which is devoid of radar. and ATC can't see you, so it's up to you to report your position and your altitude and your speed.
HF works great most of the time, except during a big flare. During a big flare, that HF communication capability could be gone within a minute or two. So as soon as we see something happening in there, or we see a flare, it's one of the first things we do is alert the aviation community, hey, big flare, HF's going to be impacted.
Once we know that there's an event going on, then the aviation industry and the airlines can react to that. They can alter their routes over the poles. They can lower the altitudes that they're flying at, or maybe decide not to fly at all in the interest of the passenger safety.
So that's just one example of how HF is used, but the emergency response community will use it a lot too. It's one of their primary backups.
When you've lost connectivity between certain government agencies, it gives you that long-range coverage to talk from out-of-state to federal governments or from the FEMA locations to the state emergency operations centers.
So if you've got a big hurricane impact in the coastline, whatever big city, we've got the cell towers down and whatnot, we've got emergency communication folks in there. Those folks are very familiar with space weather and how it impacts their systems.
Here in recent years, it was used during Katrina when we had a lot of communications outages down there. It was also used during Hurricane Ike. There was an outage of the telephone circuits with the Texas State Emergency Office, so it was used in both of those situations.
So when we talk about backup, especially for the airlines, typically they'll have SATCOM, so it'll be satellite communication.
The satellite technology that emergency responders use could be GPSs, could be satellite phones, satellite data terminals.
Space weather events can impact SATCOMs. The impact can range from a nuisance to loss of a spacecraft. So we will give them the heads up. If we have space weather events, flares, whatnot, they need to know what's impacting their systems. Situational awareness is key. Time is of essence to these folks. Again, it's life and death.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back from the marine section of the forecast. We'll start with a quick look at our ice edge. We did have full ice coverage of the Beaufort Sea yesterday. However, southwest winds have caused some openings in the ice back up in the Beaufort Sea. We do still also have ice down on the YK Delta coastline, but some of that should still be melting with some of the warmer air coming out from the south. Down in southeast for Tuesday in the inside waters, north to northwest winds 10 to 20 knots, getting stronger as we get farther to the south. However, that direction is going to shift quite a bit in southern inside waters to 25 knots out of the southeast. Out over the Gulf waters, east to southeast winds 35 to 40 knots. On Wednesday in the inside waters, southerly winds 10 to 15 knots until we get up into Lynn Canal area where we'll see northwest winds 10 knots. Wind's going to calm down quite a bit out over the Gulf waters, westerly winds 25 knots in the eastern locations, and southerly winds 15 to 20 knots up north. For South Central on Tuesday, in the northern parts of the Gulf, we're going to see easterly winds 35 knots, dropping down to 20 knots south of Seward, and then by the Barren Islands, northwest winds 25 knots. Cook Inlet area, northerly winds 15 knots, and in Prince William Sound, some stronger winds there, easterly winds 30 knots expected. On Wednesday, southerly winds throughout the Gulf, 15 to 25 knots, and then in Prince William Sound, southeast winds 20 knots. Southeast winds throughout the Cook Inlet area, about 15 knots, and again up to 20 knots west of the Barren Islands. On Tuesday for the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, starting by Kodiak Island, Shelikof Strait, westerly winds 15 knots. On the Gulf side of the island, 25 knots out of the northwest. And then westerly winds on the Pacific side of the peninsula, 25 knots. Southerly winds on the Bering side, 20 knots, and then in Bristol Bay, easterly winds 20 knots. Wednesday flow around Kodiak Island, southerly winds 20 knots expected, 10 feet on the Gulf side, 30 knots on the Bering side of the peninsula out of a west to southwest direction. Seas as high as 19 feet, highest nearest Cold Bay. Then on the Pacific side, westerly winds 25 to 30 knots. Tuesday for the Aleutians, starting off in the eastern Aleutians, westerly winds 30 to 35 knots. Out by the central Aleutians up to as high as 40 knots out of a northwesterly direction, and 25 knots out of the northwest by the western Aleutians. On Wednesday, staying out by the western Aleutians, West to northwest winds 25 to 30 knots expected. 25 to 30 knots out of the west for the central Aleutians, and then 30 knots out of the northwest for the eastern Aleutian Islands. Down the west coast of the state, southeast winds are expected 20 to 25 knots around Nunavut Island, 30 knots for the Norton Sound area, and 35 knots for St. Lawrence Island. Switching quite a bit as we move a little bit farther to the west, St. Matthew Island northwesterly winds 30 knots, and northwest for 25 knots for the Pribilof Islands. Then on Wednesday, all the southern locations going to have northwest winds 20 to 25 knots by Nunavut Island, 35 knots by St. Matthew Island and by the Pribilof Islands, where we'll see seas as high as 21 feet. Northerly winds by St. Lawrence Island, 30 knots expected, and easterly winds 15 knots for the Norton Sound. Up along the Arctic coastline, easterly winds 25 to 30 knots continuing down the northwest coast as well, and then south of the Bering Strait, southeasterly winds at 35 knots. On Wednesday, switching to become more northerly throughout the west coast, around 30 knots, dropping down to 25 and eventually 20 by AKwx. Weaker winds out of the east for the Beaufort Sea area, 10 to 15 knots expected. Recap for tonight's weather: we have a system moving out through the Bering Sea, bringing in some colder air and snow for the western Aleutian Islands, but warmer out ahead of this system, rain expected for the central and eastern Aleutians, as well as the eastern Bering. For the west coast, we are going to see primarily snow, but some of the locations of the YK Delta area right by the water are going to be warm enough for some rain, and snow continuing into the Seward Peninsula area, where we do have a winter storm warning out for heavy snow and blowing snow that will be in effect until 4 p.m. on Tuesday. Localized amounts could be up to as high as 9 inches. Again, that's on the southern side of the Seward Peninsula, including Nome. We're also going to see some snow out over the western portions of the mainland, extending from the Kaktovik area down through the interior and south central. However, some of the low-lying areas near the water of south central Alaska should still be warm enough for some rain. Rain is going to start to move into the Panhandle tonight as well, especially from the south and areas closest to the Gulf. And as we move into Tuesday, that rain is going to spread throughout the Panhandle area, with some of the higher elevations up north and for the coastal ranges starting to mix with snow. More rain and snow for south central, where low-lying areas expecting to see more rain, and then higher elevations and further interior locations starting to be snow. You want to have lighter snow throughout the rest of mainland Alaska up through the Arctic coast, down the west coast, with the southwest coastline being warm enough to see a mixture of rain and snow. Still primarily rain for the central and eastern Aleutians, but some snow out by the western Aleutian Islands. Finally, on Wednesday, snow is going to be there for much of mainland Alaska, especially along the west coast, with rain along the North Gulf Coast and snow out over the Bering Sea. Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.